Hello everyone and welcome to PC Retro Tech. In this week's video we're going to be taking another break from CGA graphics programming, which we will be getting back to shortly since I have some really exciting stuff to show you there. But instead we're going to be looking at the last of the AGP video cards from the big collection of cards that I've been reviewing on the channel for the last few months. So we're down to the last 7 AGP cards. And I assure you these have been coming out in completely random order, so I have no more idea what's coming than you do. And statistically, it's likely that the cards that we looked at last week were the most interesting because we already broke the all-time record on my rig. But let's have a look and see what we have this week. If you haven't seen the previous videos, you might like to look at those. There's a link above. It's the first of the AGP ones. But otherwise, you know the drill. Let's get stuck in and see what we've got this week. When I first saw these cards, I just thought, oh, there's a couple of old TNTs and some ATIs. It doesn't look like it's going to be very interesting, but it turns out I was wrong there. There are some interesting cards in here, but let's go through them one at a time. So the first is an Asus V7100/T, and this is a Geforce 2 MX card. It's 32 megabytes from the year 2000. So it has a core speed of 175 and memory speed of 166 megahertz. And the interesting thing is it has a 350 megahertz RAM DAC on it. So I've been telling you what the pixel pipeline arrangement is. So the number of pixel pipelines, vertex shaders, texture mapping units, and render output units. And so this one has a configuration of 2042 of each of those. So I'm going to expect this to be a relatively well-performing card, but not anything outstanding in comparison with a whole lot. But it might be an interesting card to compare with the V7700 that we've already seen on the channel. So the next one here is a Radeon Ve. That's all I could really find out about that. I had to actually power this one up to see what it is, and it's actually a VE/7000. This is not a particularly fast sounding card. It's 183 megahertz on the core and memory clock, and it's a 64 meg card, and it's from 2002. But it's only 64-bit, and it's really the bottom of the barrel in terms of performance. So in its class, it was the lowest performing card of that era. So I'm really not expecting that to be very interesting. I suspect this was probably put into workstations and the like, and not particularly interesting for gaming. So the next one is an Ati Rage 128, and again I had a lot of trouble identifying this. The problem with the Rage 128s is that there are VR and GL models, and so it took me a lot of sleuthing to figure out that this is actually a VR model. So again, this is going to be a really slow card. It's only 2 times AGP, 80 megahertz on the core and 120 megahertz on the memory, 32 megabyte card from 2000. So this is not going to perform well, we can already tell, because we've looked at Rage 128s before, and we know that they perform better than the Rage cards, but they're still not particularly impressive. But the next one is definitely an exception, and initially I was a bit confused why this was in this collection, because these are quite valuable cards, and it turns out that I actually purchased this separately before the world got turned upside down, and I ended up accidentally including it in my big collection. So I'd completely forgotten that I bought this. This is a 3DFX, and it's a Voodoo 3 card. And I thought, well, it's not really fair to include this because I didn't buy this with this collection. But then I realized it's actually going to be quite interesting to compare this with some of the other cards. This is a 1999 card, so very early compared to the others we have today. And it was made by STB Systems. So it's only 2 times AGP and 166 megahertz on the core and memory speed. So it's not a particularly fast sounding card, but of course 3DFX has a reputation, and so it's going to be really interesting, not so much to compare against all the other cards in the collection, but to compare against all the other cards from 1999. So I'm really looking forward to that. These are a fairly rare card, and it is really nice to actually own one of these. And I have powered it up and it does actually seem to work. So this is going to be really interesting, I think. The next one in the list is another Rage 128, and the difference with this one is that this is the GL model. So that'll make an interesting comparison to see how much slower the GL actually was, or faster in fact. And otherwise it's going to perform fairly similar, I think, to the other Rage 128s that we'll have looked at by that point. Now here we have a Radeon 9200 SE, and you remember on the channel I had a problem for a while identifying one of these cards, these 9200s, because the label was damaged and I couldn't see whether it was an LE or an SE. Well, one of the viewers actually had a suggestion to look up the vendor ID for the card and then just look at photos of the card. So I didn't even need to go that far. I hunted around on Windows in the driver settings and eventually found that the card that we had before was an SE. But you'll remember that we had this weird thing where we had 3 different 9200s and they all performed completely differently, and there wasn't any explanation for it because there are only supposed to be 2 9200 cards, the 9200 and the 9200 SE. So it'll be very interesting to compare this SE with the other cards that we have. We now know that we had some other SEs, and see which is the more normal performance for a 9200 SE. So I'm looking forward to that because that might be the end of a mystery. And this chunky looking thing here is a LedTech card, which is a brand we haven't seen in here yet. And it's actually an NVIDIA FX 5600. And this is actually from the generation after the Geforce 4s. So it actually has a chance of performing really well on this rig. If it has Windows 98 drivers, this could actually break the record from last week. But I'm not sure about that. Sometimes NVIDIA introduce new cards and the lower end ones in the new selection weren't at all faster than the higher end cards in the old selection, and so I really have no idea whether this has a chance of beating the Geforce 4 Ti or the Radeon 9600 that we've benchmarked that actually broke the record on this rig. But it is 2003. Both the Radeon 9200 and this card have a render configuration of 4144, so they are fairly beefy cards. And this one has 325 MHz core and 275 MHz memory, so it's also a 128-bit card and 8 times AGP. So it has every chance of being really impressive. So I've left that one to last, although it just happened to be last in the collection in the order that I got them out. So let's see if that one has a chance of breaking the record on the rig or not. Well, I've got to the end of another marathon benchmarking session, and as you can see I've got the 3D Mark 99 scores here. So we've said before that these really only show you something about the pixel pushing power of the card and very little about the 3D performance, and it's the later benchmarks that tell you about that. But even so, the scores here are really surprising. First of all, they're all over the place. But the interesting one for me is that LedTech 5600 at the end there. This was the card that I was hoping would actually break some records on the rig, or at least come close to it. But you can see that the pixel pushing power of this card is really low. It's about 50% slower than the fastest cards we've seen in this benchmark on this rig. So I don't know what's with that, and I'm hoping that the later benchmarks it will pick up a lot, although even if it were to break the record on this rig, I'm not sure if I would use this unless it was really way ahead in 3D performance, because its pixel pushing performance is so poor. So you do see that the Rage 128s there are slow, as we predicted they would be. And it's curious that there's not very much difference between the GL and the VR. they're actually pretty close in performance in this benchmark at least, but the GL is slightly faster as we would expect, even though it's only a 16 megabyte card, because it has higher clocks, of course. So the other interesting one is the Radeon Ve 7000. Now I wasn't expecting this to perform very well at all because, as I said, it's the bottom of the barrel in its class. But it's actually done relatively well on this benchmark, but I predict that it won't do well in 3D Mark 2000 or 2001. So that V7100, there's not really anything to say about that. It's a bit early in the benchmarks to draw any conclusions. We know that the Geforce 2s do pretty well in this benchmark. We've seen that before. And obviously it's around about the same score as every other card. So let's wait a little bit more before we comment on those. The Voodoo 3 has done quite well here. Bear in mind that is a 1999 card. So it did have a lot of pixel pushing power. I think I forgot to mention before that this is actually the 3000 model. There is a Voodoo 3 2000, a 3000 and a 3500. And this is the 3000 model. So I actually tried to buy one of these for quite some time, and they just were going for far too much online. And in one case someone was selling a pair of the cards and I didn't really want two of them, and that was very expensive. So I'm actually really lucky to have this one. Wanted one for quite a while. I've seen collections of Voodoo cards, you know, all the way from the original Voodoo through to Voodoo 5 going for like 1,500 euros online. So these can be really expensive cards, especially the later ones. Anyway, let's have a look at the 3D Mark 2000 scores. And here they are, and you can see that this tells a completely different story. That LEDTech card, for example, is now lapped to the front. It's way faster than, for example, the 9200, which is also a 2003 card. But unfortunately, it hasn't broken the record on this rig, which is over 10,000 for the 9600 that we saw previously. So it is a very good card, it's just not the best. And I forgot to mention that in the 99 benchmark, this was only getting 50 frames a second on the car benchmark at the start, where you'd normally expect to see a really good card pushing out a flat 75. So it really is just being held back by its lack of horsepower, I think. But other than that, it was pretty good. I did notice that it had a little bit of a pasty white appearance to some of the textures, so it wasn't really very impressive in terms of its image quality. One card that was impressive in image quality was that V7100 at the beginning there. That had absolutely crystal clear, sharp images. It was really impressive. But I wasn't sure if the fog was working, and that would certainly explain why some of the images looked clearer, you know, if there's no fog there to kind of blur it up. So there may actually be a driver issue there, but it certainly didn't take away from the experience for me. I quite enjoyed it. So all of the four cards in the middle were very slow by the time you get to the 2000 benchmarks. There was some jerking and skipped tests and so on. But it's interesting that Voodoo 3, even though it's a 99 card, so it's the earliest card in the bunch, is really beating out some of these other cards. I mean, that VE7000, that's 2002. So the Voodoo cards obviously performed really well. And this sort of explains why 3DFX has the reputation it does. And it'll be really interesting when we get to the 2001 benchmarks to go back and look at all the other 99 cards and see exactly what this does in comparison. The other reason to have a Voodoo card, of course, is because of the 3DFX games. And I've heard by rumour that Screamer 2 has a 3DFX patch. Now that's one of my favourite games of all time. Now apparently it's hard to get going, but I'm going to try because I have an original copy of Screamer 2, and I suspect that people who've had trouble getting that running maybe because they don't have an original copy of the game. So I'm going to have a look at that, and that'll be at the end of the video if I get it to work. So the 128GL, the Rage GL, is a little bit faster than the VR, and it's actually a lot faster than I thought it would be in comparison. I would have expected maybe a 10% difference there, but it's really much more than that. And it's annoying that these cards don't have written on them whether they are VR or GL, because it isn't easy to figure that out without sort of plugging the card in and powering it up. But even still, as you can see, they're nothing special, so I guess it's not that big of a downside. So the Radeon Ve 7000, as I mentioned, that's a 2002 card, and you can see that its performance here is really terrible, and I suspect it'll be even worse in the 2001 benchmark. As I said before, that is the bottom of the barrel for its era. It's really a dreadful card, so not one I can recommend in any way. It had some really weird problems with the 9200. So basically everything was working acceptably well with all of the cards this week, but I did notice in the bump mapping in the Radeon 9200 there was a kind of peeling effect. It looked like the textures were peeling off the object, and that's definitely not something you want to see. So there was obviously a driver issue there. I doubt very much that it's a faulty card, or I would have seen it in other benchmarks and so on. I think it is just a driver issue. So that's maybe something to watch out for with 9200s. The other weird thing is, as I mentioned, we've looked at some other 9200s before, including SEs, and this one has completely different performance again. So we now have 4 different 9200s with completely and totally different performance. I mean, there's more than a 50% difference between the fastest and slowest 9200 that we've looked at. And I have no idea why this is. So this is a real mystery and an ongoing mystery. Why are the 9200s so variable in performance? We just haven't seen this with any other card. Normally they're within a few points of each other, like 10 for example. If I go back and look at the other ATI 128 VR, for example, it's very, very close in performance. And, everything else we've looked at, the TNT2s and so on, if I go back and look at other cards that I benchmarked previously on this rig, I get almost exactly the same scores, but not with the 9200. So I find that fascinating. Anyway, let's move on to the 2001 benchmarks and see how all of these cards finish up. And well, here are the 2001 benchmarks, and you can see that the story actually hasn't changed at all here. The lead tech is still in the lead, and it's again nowhere near the record. There was over 8,000 points for the 9600 TX. So this is a little bit disappointing, but not too surprising after we saw that abysmal 3D Mark 99 score. I did go back and have a look at all of the other 1999 cards to compare against that Voodoo 3. And there are actually 6 other cards that we looked at. There was the Creative Reaver TNT, which was actually 98. There was a Rage XL, 99. TNT2 M64. We actually had 2 of those, both Elsa brand. They are 99. And the Rage Pro Turbo, which is 98, and there was the Rage 128 GL. And so the result is that Voodoo 3 absolutely wipes the slate with all of them. It really is much faster. The only thing that actually came close was the TNT2 M64. This got around about 5,600 points approximately. There was a little bit of variation there in the 3D Mark 99 benchmarks, and the 3D Effects card's getting 6,779. So obviously it's better, in terms of raw pixel pushing power. The TNT2s were getting 2,107 points, and we were getting 3,339 for the Voodoo 3 card in the 2000 benchmarks. And as you can see here, we have a score of 2003. Well, that is way ahead of everything else. In fact, a lot of those other cards I mentioned The 1998 ones in particular, but even one of the 99 cards didn't even run the 2001 benchmark. And the highest score that we got there was 865. So you can see that 2003 is way ahead of that. So these are a fantastic card for the era in which they came out. It's really a shame, I think, that 3DFX went under in the end, or rather were bought out. So it's a bit of a disappointment that happened, because they were really fantastic cards back in the day. At least the first three were. I've never seen a Voodoo 4 or Voodoo 5, so I can't comment on those. So that Rage 128 VR, you can see that has fallen shockingly far behind the GL now. And that's really a surprise to me. As I said, I only expected a very, very small difference between the two, but it's really substantial now. And a 441, well, this was virtually a slideshow in the 2001 benchmark, so not at all worth having. And again, the VE 7000, not worth having. So the other cards, there's really not much else to add. I think I've said all of the interesting things about those. So now I'm going to take a look at the Screamer 2 game, and I have actually managed to get it to run with the 3DFX card, which is really cool. So I've heard that a few YouTubers have had some problems doing this, and I think it's probably just down to not having an original disc, because the game does go looking for the disc. So I'll explain exactly what I did, just in case something I did made the difference. First of all, I installed the game on the hard drive, of course, and it just creates an S2 directory. I think I even went for just a medium install, and I made sure the game was working and the sound was set up and everything was fine before I moved on. So the next thing I did is I went to Phil's Computer Lab's website, and he has there some files that you can drop into that directory. So Phil, of course, is a great retro computing YouTuber. More recently, he's been doing much more recent hardware than I would be looking at. But great content, and thanks again, Phil, for your website, which is a great service for the retro community. So on that, there are two options. If you have Voodoo 2 or later, which is what we have, you need to get the specific 3DFX patch that's available there for Voodoo 2 or later, and also a .ovl file, which is needed in that case. And there's some interlacing issue. It's totally unusable without that, but Phil has found that if you put that file in as well, then everything runs. So I dropped those two files. They're very small. The executable is only 1 megabyte actually. Dropped that into the directory on the hard drive, the S2 directory, and then to get the game to run, I first of all put the disk in. You always need the disk in for it to work, and it comes up, the auto run gives you an option of starting the game. Now you don't want to do that because it's just going to use the old executable. So I cancelled that and then went to the directory and actually clicked on the 3DFX executable instead, and everything worked. So there are some minor issues, as you'll see, but otherwise it's completely playable and we can see what it looks like. So let's take a look at that now. So this is the Screamer 2 game, and you'll notice first of all that there are a couple of breaks in the textures. There's some green lines that appear. The textures don't quite meet up. And so that's a little bit of a disappointment compared to the original, but otherwise it seems to be working okay. And so what I'm going to do to finish out this video is just do a little bit of a playthrough. I'm not very good at driving this thing anymore, unfortunately. It's been many years since I've done this. But that's all I have for this week. There'll be one more video in this series on assorted cards that are not AGP, so mainly PCI Express. But that's the end of the AGP ones. So we'll see you in a later video. Bye.